All right, happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody. My camouflage Crocs have green on them. Let's first of all start with our example we did Friday, get that out of the way. I've been enjoying questions, conversations. If you guys have any questions, don't hesitate to ask to make sure we have a good understanding. So we did on Friday this one. Oh, how appropriate. Green shirt. Joint. All right. Pelvis. Remember, pelvic girdle rotation is from the perspective of the pelvis, how it's spinning. So pelvis, the front of the pelvis, I think in the materials have something silly like the penguin in the pelvis because it kind of looks like a little penguin. So the penguin is actually facing the ground. So this is transverse pelvic girdle rotation, just like this would be transverse pelvic rotation. Does that make sense? So this would be left transverse pelvic girdle rotation, right, left, and the hip motion would be right hip horizontal abduction. So in other words, from the hips perspective, from here to there would be the exact same as, see if I can find a better way to do this. I know you guys don't judge me for my lack of range of motion. So what I just did from here to there would be the exact same motion as if like I started here and did that, right, hip horizontal ab. It's just I moved the socket about ball. There to there gets me to the same place that is from there to there. Make sense? Any follow-up questions before we move on to the elbow and the radiology? All right, this is fun. This is probably my favorite lecture because just the radiology thing is so neat. Right? So what we're going to start off with is the elbow is distal humerus and proximal ulna. Right, so hinge joint. You can see here that big, it looks like a big C, but that olecranon on the ulna. If you remember, our knee didn't have a big olecranon. In fact, our knee's version of that is our patella. So like, in other words, this club right here evolves down and is literally floating in there so that we can rotate our knee. That's how we're able. If you look at an x-ray of an elbow, it almost kind of looks like a knee. There's the patella and it would be pulling there. So what's neat is that because this segment of bone is still there, it's not going to allow rotation at the elbow. It's going to be a traditional heel street. But just like our ankle and subtalar were two separate joints that live in the same apartment complex, like and so therefore, because they live in the same building, they get interchangeably used with each other. In other words, subtalar motion commonly is referred to as ankle motion, even though those are not the same things. It's like I was trying to think of other analogies like that. The Albertsons Parking Center doesn't just have an Albertson store. There's other stores there, right? So, but we say the Albertsons Parking Center because it's the biggest store. It's the most widely known store. So the ankle joint, very popular, well known. Not many other people understand or know the subtalar and transverse dorsal joints. So it makes sense that we just kind of say the ankle and then all the other stuff kind of gets bypassed. So it's very similar with the elbow and the radial ulna joint. The radial ulna joint is how the radius literally rotates about the ulna. It's a very specialized joint called a pivot joint, Latin trochoid joint. But it's a uniaxial joint, but instead of a hinge, instead of a regular door that would have general motion, right? Some translation and some rotation. Think of it as a revolving door. That would be more pure rotation. More pure rotation. So the head of the radius is almost kind of like a clock. And the radius can wrap and unwrap itself about the home. We'll get into the special features that comes with that. But the key is that the joint itself is in the same water balloon. It's in the same joint capsule as the elbow. And so it makes sense, kind of elbow motion, but those are two separate articulations. In addition, your radius is one bone, and it wraps and unwraps about the elbow. But distally, so proximally we're spinning, distally we're spinning also. However, that rotation is not happening. This is important. I'm going to show you, I'm going to prove to you. This rotation that you do like this is not happening at your wrist. That's very key. It might feel like it's happening at your wrist because your wrist repositions itself. But if you take your wrist, okay, follow along with me if you want to kind of feel what I'm talking about. You can passively flex and extend your wrist. You can passively what we call ulna and radial deviation. But you can't passively rotate your wrist. If you do, you feel your forearm. If you put your hand in the middle of your forearm, you feel motion there. But you can't passively rotate your wrist by itself. Does that make sense? Your wrist doesn't twist. Copyright Brian Hill. Your wrist doesn't twist. And it makes sense why we don't want it to twist. Guys, you have a ton of wiring that goes into these very dexterous things that you do with your fingers. You have a lot of nerves. A lot of nerves. Your ratio to motor unit to nerve, right? It's very few. The ratio. In other words, you don't have one nerve that innervates several hundred or thousand fibers in quads. You have a very low ratio. So in other words, the plumbing that you have that crosses your wrist, those wires, nerves, arteries, veins, you don't want to twist them up like you would an animal balloon. You know, when you twist animal balloons and you make stuff, you don't want to take all the plumbing here and this way. Sounds like a pretty bad day. You want to make sure all that wiring stays lined up with all the little bones, all the little red back end. So the wrist joint itself does not twist. It's literally the radius, proximal and distal radius, wrapping and unwrapping itself about the ulna. Let me give you a practical example of how this concept works. If you had let's say Ken was laying supine. Our radius in anatomical position is standing supine. Where do you think pronation and supination comes from? It's root off of supine and prone. Okay, so in anatomical position, the radius, which is on the outside, the lateral side. So in this analogy, since I happen to have a left, Ken, by the way, the MVP of class, Ken, give it up to Ken, multi-versatile. So the head of the radius, the head of Ken, supine. The analogy would be like if Ken was laying supine in bed, even though he's standing supine, just imagine, he's laying supine in bed. And he goes from a supine position to a prone position, but he keeps his head on his pillow. You can imagine that maybe his body might wrap around his pillow or wrap around his partner. In other words, the feet might drift to the other side of the bed, but his head stays on his pillow. Does that make sense? It's very similar. In a supine position, head and feet are lined up. And when Ken goes to roll over in a prone position, his head stays on the pillow, but his feet and body wrap around to the other side. In other words, in a supine position, The head and feet are both lateral. They're both on the outside. But when Ken wraps in a prone position, the head stays on the pillow, the head stays lateral, but the feet now go to the medial part of the arm. A lateral part of a bone goes to the medial part of the arm. And that's the biggest clue. That's the hint where you can tell whether you're wrapped or unwrapped. Because your thumb will always be lined up with your radius. The reason is because the wrist doesn't twist. So in other words, your thumb is always lateral. And when you pronate, you bring the lateral thumb to the medial part. That's how you know whether you're wrapped. Because your thumb is on the medial part of your elbow. Thumb lateral, unwrapped. Thumb medial, wrapped. I call it the thumb rule. And what if Ken, there's kind of three positions you could be in. Some people sleep on their back, some people sleep on their tummy, and some people kind of sleep halfway, like kind of on your side. And so when Ken is halfway, we have a word for that. We call that semi-prone, a semi-prone position. Have you ever heard that before? Semi-prone position. So that's how pronation, supination is really a spin-off of going prone or going supine. It has nothing to do with a soup bowl. It has everything to do with literally going supine or going prone. The reason we don't want to do soup bowls in here is because that's a global reference. And on the test, I'm going to do things over my head. We're going to do things in non-traditional ways, and there's going to be no bowls about it. You're going to have to be able to use the thumb as a reference to see if you're wrapped or unwrapped. I'll give an example. From here to there is actually pronation. Even though you might see a soup bowl at the ceiling, I'm wrapped because my thumb is medial. So I don't want to use that silly analogy because it doesn't work all the time. Local references work all the time. That's why we're going to teach you so. The reason we have the radial ulna joint is for this, for our fingers, to be able to reposition our hands. What's the biggest reason, one of the biggest reasons mechanically that makes us humans pretty special. So being able to reposition the hands. Let me give you an example with our Ken doll. Ken is now going to be representative of my lower arm because again, he's versatile. So if all I did was flex my elbow, you'd go from seeing the front of Ken to the back of Ken. But with the radial ulna joint, we can do stuff like this. So that I can keep my hands working on things, even though I need to flex my elbows. Does that make sense? It allows you to keep your hands gripping on things, holding on things, moving with your shoulders, and maintain your position of where you need. Literally repositioning your hand 180 degrees is of great use to us. So that's really what it's about. It's about repositioning your hand literally 180 degrees. And with the shoulder, it could be even more. You could get a whole 360 between the internal rotation of your shoulder and the pronation and supination of your radial ulna. Okay. So in anatomical position, we are supine, facing forward. We are supine. The act of wrapping the radius about the ulna is an act of going prone. That's why we call that pronation. And the act of going supine, thus why we call it supination. Semi-prone or halfway, being on your side. The reason it's called semi-prone and not semi-supine is because the anatomical position is supine. So in other words, if you start in anatomical, the only way to get to halfway is to have pronation to get there. So that's why it's called semi-prone. If anatomical position was fully prone, then we call this a semi-supinated. But this is anatomical, so therefore to get to halfway, to get on your side, you have to have pronation. Therefore, you are prone relative to anatomical. Semi-prone. Does that make sense? So the radial ulnar joint, simple in terms of its motion and options, complex when it comes to illusions. And that's my job, is to teach you how to see those illusions. So anatomical position, left radial ulnar joint pronation, left radial ulnar joint supination, right pronation, right supination. How can you tell? Thumb rule. Anatomical position, thumb is lateral. Fully prone, thumb is medial. Let's look at how it would look like with my elbows flexed. Elbows flexed, pronation, supination, thumb lateral. That didn't change anything. If I flex and extend, my thumb's still lateral. Semi-prone, halfway. Fully prone, all the way. Now my thumb is medial. Okay. Where it gets sometimes tricky is when I have different elbow and wrist positions. So like stuff like this, stuff like this. Get into some of these later on. That's all radial ulnar joints. Even illusions like we did this on one of the first days of class, where I gave you this and I said, do you think you remember that one in class? And I showed you that your radial ulnar joint, when you go from here to here, actually has motion in it. Let's do it. Hands at your side. Hands at your side, facing forward. And then go all the way up. You had pronation of your radial ulnar joints when you did that. I want you to see, take a few seconds to see if you see it, feel it. It's gradual. It's happening with your shoulder. Measure this. Does Superman fly prone or supine? Does he fly like this or does he fly like this? Flies prone, right? So if you start here and you say, okay, shoulders flex, Superman doesn't fly like that. See new position. Start, my thumbs are lateral. Finish, whoa, my thumbs are medial. So gradually, while you did this is what happened. Gradually, while you abducted and externally rotated your shoulders, you pronated so that your hand can stay facing. Because if you didn't, you go from seeing the front again to seeing the back again. In other words, did that. Sense? So a lot of times the radial ulnar joint motions that we see with the shoulder are gradual. They happen slowly to keep the hand in a certain position that you want it to be. Make sense? Pronation, supination, pronation, supination, pronation, supination, pronation, supination, pronation, supination. All right, how about this one? I'll give you some to practice. All right, these are easy to practice. Just you have to get up. Hand over your head, tap your head, note your position, and go from your palm facing your head to your palm facing the ceiling. And try to use the thumb rule. Don't use soup bowls. use your thumb rule to try to figure out your position change of your radio ulnar joint. Lindsay, feel free to think of some other examples that we've done. We try to remember all the tricky ones, but wow, with all. Okay, what position did I start off at? Am I prone or supine? Good. Here's one way to prove it. All right. I'm going to reposition my whole body. I didn't move my radial ulnar joint, right? It's still. If I move my radial ulnar joint, you'll see it. I didn't move my radial ulnar joint. That's my start position. Make sense? Thumbs lateral. See it? Supination, pronation. Supination, pronation. Because although this looks really nice with the whole soup bowl thing, I could dump the soup over my head and still be supine. We don't want to be acidic. We want to look at local references and be able to tell the position whether we're wrapped or unwrapped, whether we're in a supine, facing forward or laying up, or in a prone, facing back or laying down. All right. Any questions about our first illusion? All right, let's go to another one, shall we? Let's choose the landmarks here. I'm gonna try to trick you with the wrist, but we haven't learned wrist yet. Well, we know flexion and extension, right? So we could go there. Here's my start position. Wrist, elbow, radial ulna. I think that's fair. And here's the finish. Wrist, elbow, radial ulna. Let's shape the Etch-a-Sketch. Start. Finish. This is an example of what I'm trying to teach you, tools that I'm trying to teach you. Movement happens faster than what our eyes can process. It's not your fault. That's just the way we're designed. It can only handle so many frames per second. Well, what we can do is use clues. Where was my start? Where was my finish? And how did I have to move to go from A to B? In terms of elbow and wrist, flexion and extension for now. And I haven't given you the radial ulnar deviation. And for the radial ulnar joint, pronation, supination, remaining. Okay. Let's do it one more time. Is this where I started? All right, so palm up. I'm going to give you some time. Feel free to discuss it with your neighbor or the voices in your head like I do. But to me, that's the best learning. Hey, this is what I was thinking. And if they have something different, that gives you a chance to discuss it. Analyze motion how? Joint by joint. So we don't want to tackle everything at once. We just want to pick a place and do that one. What are you more, let's say elbow would probably be the easiest. So my elbow started in a flexed position, finished in a flexed position. Remember, I'm not going to ask you, midhead. I'm only going to ask you obvious motions, all right? So my elbow didn't have significant motion. Great, check that box. My wrist, did I start off in a flexed or an extended position? Extended relative to anatomical. Good. Did I stay extended? No, I ended in a flexed position. Guys, regardless of whether you see it or not, the only way to go from being extended to being flexed is to have flexion. I'm going to prove this to you, but just use common sense. The only way to go from being extended to being flexed, whether you saw it or not, is to have flexion. Just because you fell asleep in the car and you wound up in Florida, you had to go east, whether or not you were awake or not. All right, radial on a joint. Talk to me about the thumb rule. Is my thumb lateral or medial in my start? Am I lateral or medial to start? Lateral, absolutely. What about finish? The only way that can happen is if I had pronation. Thumb rule for the flip and win. Flip, get it? Flip my hand. So guys, this is what happened. It just happened at the same time. Right wrist, pronation, right wrist, flexion. Or right wrist flexion and right wrist pronation. It's just those two things happened at the same time. So it looked like this. But it was really and happening simultaneously. One of the first lectures in class is the same as this, just happening at the same time. This and this is the same as this, just happening at the same time. So they cancel out rotations in some translations. Make sense? All right, how about this one? This will be fun, because I just thought of this one, so we'll see how it goes. Maybe it's a winner, maybe it's not. I start here. I'm just going to do this one. I start here, and I scratch my back. Talk to me about, if any, I don't mean 10 further is, but talk to me about potential radial ulnar joint contribution to that function of starting in this position and then scratching my back. Aren't you guys? Process. Human motion can be difficult sometimes, but the process can be the same every time. And there should be comfort and confidence in the process. So if we're analyzing radial ulnar joint, I'm not disrespecting elbow and shoulder. It's just we're not having that conversation. We can have that conversation after if you want. So it's not like I'm ignoring that it didn't happen. It's just we're having radial ulnar joint conversation. So we want to lock in to the local clues, the references that we know for radial ulnar joint motion. Talk about whatever we want. So to start, my starting position, is my radial ulnar joint prone or supine? It's prone, absolutely. It's wrapped. My radius is wrapped around my ulna. Does that make sense? And the clues is because my thumb is medial to my ulna. Now, one of the reasons we do not want to assume is, I would suspect some students would think, well, my thumb, or at least if you go off of global references of hand, you say, well, the back of my hand is here, so maybe it's still the back of my hand out here. It's like, oh, we don't want to assume. We want to still use our local landmarks. We want to still use our local references. We say, okay, when I'm scratching my back, is my thumb lateral, medial? Absolutely. So the only way I could go from being prone to being supine is to have right radial ulnar joint supination, even though you may not see it. Because again, these spinning things happen fast. Has anybody ever seen a figure skater spin really fast? Like pure rotation can happen quick. General motion takes more time. It takes a lot longer to do this than it does to do this, okay? So especially those pure rotation ones, we need to utilize our landmarks and utilize our position genes. Does that make sense? I started off prone, I ended up supine. So I had to have supination when I had to change. If I didn't supinate, I would have to have done this. Make sense? All right, let me give you a different kind of example. Let's go playing the national anthem. We put our hand over our heart, okay, elbow down. One way to tell if you're semi-prone, so we have fully supine, fully prone. One way you can tell that if you're semi-prone, and it should make some logical sense, from this position, can I supinate or can I pronate? Like in other words, if you're on I-10 and supine means you're all the way east. In other words, when you're fully supine, you can't go any further. Fully prone would mean like you're all the way west. And semi-prone means you could travel east or west, right? You're somewhere in the middle. So one way to test whether you're semi-prone, so if we put our hand over our heart, you say, okay, from this position, can I supinate? Yeah. From this position, can I pronate? Yeah. So it's a great way to show you that you're somewhere in the middle. I think students will miss this kind of question because as you extend the elbow, because you want to bring it as a reference to anatomical, it's logical for students to supinate as they're coming back down. And thus, you totally lose your position of where you were at. Does that make sense? So in other words, if I was here and I kept my radial ulnar joint supine, I would actually put like my pinky over here. I have to do this to get to this position. So be careful when you're doing radial ulnar joint position changes. That's why I do silly things like this, is to show you that I didn't spin while I came back down. That's a big deal. No, it's not a huge deal. But your brain wants to keep local references. So what I mean by that is if you have a soup bowl over your head, your instinct is to maintain that soup bowl as you bring it down. And you're going to totally lose track of the position you're in because you're literally changing your position as you bring it down. So some students will miss it on the test because they're like, well, wait, aren't I supine up here? And I'm like, no, you're prone up there. And they're like, well, wait, when I bring it back down, I'm supine. I'm like, you made it supine as you came down. Does that make sense? So be careful of those global landmarks. Be careful of those global landmarks. All right. How about this one? Lindsay, can you think of any other? Oh, yeah, we'll do that. Do the old in the 80s. There was a song called Walk Like an Egyptian by the Bangs. Okay. So let's do this one. Start. Everybody. Look, I'm not looking at you, so I'm not judging you. I only judge you when I look at you. To judge. Fingers pointing this way to fingers pointing that way. Okay, so fingers pointing to your left, fingers pointing to your right. Now, right away, hopefully you'll hear some of my lessons. It may seem like those are doing the same thing. Like, you know how like windshield wipers are doing the same thing, but they're mirrors of each other. It's like saying, are my shoulders doing the same thing? Well, yeah, maybe globally, but not locally. Or my shoulders doing the same thing? Yeah, globally, but not locally, right? So you got to remember that it's a local reference. They're mirrors of each other. If you were in a mirror and you did this, if you were in a mirror and you did this, and your other hand did that, that is a possessed mirror. The same motion would be this in the mirror, okay? So just be mindful that it may look like they're doing the same thing globally, but they may not be doing the same thing locally. We analyze motion joint by joint, and that includes if we're moving the same joint. What I mean by that is, both radial ulnar joints had motion. So we're going to analyze the left separately from the right because there's no law that says they have to do the same thing. Make sense? So since I'm left-handed, any other fellow lefties? Right. Is the left wrapped or unwrapped to start? Am I prone or supine? Good. Since started off prone, ended up supine, I had to have left radial ulnar joint supination for my left. Maybe I had the same for my right. I don't assume. Start here. This has nothing to do with my left. Let's go to my right. Thumb rule says that I'm lateral. So I started off in a supine position. My in position is prone. So my right radial ulnar joint had to have pronation. Does everybody understand why this might look like it's the same motion globally, but it's not? This would be the same motion. Supination, pronation. Supination, pronation. Supination, pronation. That would be the same motion. It's a mirror effect. Make sense? All right, let's try this one. I think their lack of questions is a function of their understanding. I think they get it. They're paying attention. You know, they're not doing lines, you know, like my last semester's class. Did y'all see, how many of you go on Twitter, you know, like you get your news from Twitter, sports stuff? Did you see the, I think it was the Washington baseball player who did a line celebration after his triple? Y'all see that? He got a triple and he celebrated by pretending to do a line on, I don't know what a line is, but I think Charlie Sheen made it famous or something like that. It was hysterical. So that was in my brain. All right, guys, let's have some fun. Start off in anatomical position, and we're going to go shoulders flexed, and we're going to bring. I'm not going to tell you motion because I want us to think about it. But go make your hands face outside, just like that. So like thumbs down. Let's go right over left, and interlock your hands. Okay, and from here, do this. And let's talk about elbow and radial ulna. And we could have a shoulder conversation too, if you think about it. We could have a shoulder conversation in terms of a variation of ab and ad. And we could also have a shoulder conversation in regard to spin. So a lot of stuff there. Guys, this is good practice because I'm teaching you. You are in my family tree in terms of an educational family. This could be overwhelming. So what do? We take it joint by joint. We take it plane by plane. We take it part by part. And the sum total of all those little parts gets us some pretty crazy, knock myself out, gets us some pretty cool, crazy function. But all of those neat pictures we do with the Etch-a-Sketch are still just simple knobs that when they're moved together can make some complex things happen. Right over left. And I would love for us to have a shoulder conversation here, a shoulder conversation here. I'd love us to have an elbow conversation. I'd love us to be able to have a wrist conversation. We know flexion and extension. I'd love us to be able to have a radial ulnar joint conversation if there's one to be had. Open-ended. You guys tell me what you found. Ready, go. I'll give you good time on this one. Open-ended. Tell me what you find. That's a Jimmy Neutron hair today. A long weekend. You had a question? So he wants to whatever helps you learn. Absolutely. That's what I kind of like about I never tell you how to learn. Everybody learns a little differently. So if that helps you absorb the knowledge, feel free. Does anybody study at the library anymore? I want to see, like, before our next exam, I want you to be in the library. So is there a problem not studying? Lindsay, do you have any insight on, is that how I explained it, is that clean for you as well, or do you have any other tactics that you kind of use for radiology? The thumb rule. The thumb rule is never wrong. Yeah, you can all feel it. Yeah. And the reason the thumb rule works all the time, like it's not even about Anchorman, where he's like 60% of the time it works every time. Like no, 100% of the time. And that's because the wrist doesn't twist in its transverse plane. Like the thumb will always be radial side and the pinky will always be ulnar side. If your thumb by itself goes over to the ulna, that's a bad day. Like you need medical attention. So that's why it works, because the wrist doesn't twist. So it's always going to be on the radial side. So if you take the distal radius and you plop it over to the medial part of the arm, that's why this works. All right, you guys, let's analyze joint by joint. Let's do the easy one. Elbow's pretty easy, elbow flexion. So let's say A, B, B, C. So in other words, we'll separate it into parts. Elbow flexion from A to B, and then my elbows kind of stay flexed from B to C, right? So I had flexion to here, But then I really didn't have any significant elbow motion when I brought it back in. Make sense? Okay. Now let's go to my shoulder. We'll save the radioulnar joint for last. My shoulder, I had bilateral shoulder horizontal abduction, right, to start, because I kind of have to create some space so that my forearms can come in. So horizontal abduction. Now, my biceps are kind of facing each other here. And when I do this, they're kind of facing the ceiling. So the only way that can happen is if I have external or lateral rotation. So I had bilateral shoulder, external or lateral rotation when I went from B to C. Does that make sense? So horizontal ab, and then bilateral, external or lateral. My wrists, I had wrist flexion when I went from A to B. And then I had wrist extension when I went from B to C. So that's why we kind of had to break it into parts, because if I went from, that's like saying I went from Lafayette to Breaux Bridge and then back to Lafayette. If I eliminated the Breaux Bridge part, you'd think I'd have never left the house. So that's why we went like from A to B, I had wrist flexion, and then from B to C, I had wrist extension. So if I just went from A to C, you would think the wrist didn't move. That's why we had to chop it up on the bits. All right, let's do radioulnar joint. Do I start off with my radioulnar joint pronated or supinated? Am I wrapped or unwrapped? Good. Good. Good luck. Wrapped. What about now? Good. So I had to have bilateral radioulnar joint, and this is where it happens. This is where the magic happens. I couldn't do it here. For me to have bilateral supination here, I'd have to unlock my fingers. And for me to have motion here, I'd have to unwrap my fingers. But when you come here, this is what allows you to have bilateral radioulnar joint motion. This is the secret right here. So does that make sense? I had bilateral radioulnar joint supination. But you know what I think is cool? Maybe I'm biased. If the first day of class I'd have just done this, but you learn tools, like you have tools now in your toolkit that can help you figure these things out. And it's not about memorization. It's about learning local references, not being tricked by global references, and analyzing motion joint by joint, side by side, joint by joint. Where are you at? Where did you go? How did you have to move to get there? It looks like it's moving, but it might not be. Looks like it's not moving, but it might be. Get your money's worth. Hold on. Let's see. All right, last one, I'm not going to go over it. I'm going to give it to you, and then we'll talk about it next week. On Wednesday. Let's do the upright row that we did last class, but instead of shoulder, let's look at radioulnar joint. Start, finish. Your radioulnar joint, I'm telling you, your radioulnar joint moves in order to keep your fingers under the ball. Meaning, if your radioulnar joint stayed prone, when you would do this, your thumb would now be under the bar. Look, I'm staying prone. Does that make sense? So to maintain your functional grip, your radioulnar joint has to do some stuff. We'll talk about that on this. Yeah, okay.